Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Keir Giles, and I'm your host for this afternoon's session on countering malign influence. And what a day we've chosen to do this. This was very carefully arranged to come at one of the busiest news cycles we've seen in a long time. Over the last 24 hours, there's been so much that we could talk about for hours on end. There's been a resurrection of UK allegations of Russian interference in elections, vaccine hacking, Twitter hacks with all of the implications that might have for targeted information operations. And next week, of course, here in the UK, we've got the release of the Russia report by the Intelligence and Security Committee, which a lot of people are expecting will show a lot of new information about malign influence in the UK. Well, here to talk all about all of that are two very special guest speakers, as charming as they are erudite. We have people who are going to not recap for you known information, are not going to be admiring the problem, not going to be talking about well-known case studies of disinformation all over again. Instead, we hope they're going to be bringing a fresh perspective. Not just Russia, which is usually the bugbear when we're talking about a European or North American perspective and very familiar to us. Instead, lessons from three continents. And here's how that's going to work. Our guests today are Matt Sussex, to his friends Professor Matthew Sussex from the National Security College at Australian National University. Now, Matthew is a Russia specialist working in a country that's primarily preoccupied about China. And that gives him a different perspective, not only comparing and contrasting the problems that are posed by those two actors in malign influence, but also, and Matthew has written about this with co-authors, comparing and contrasting what Australia does about the problem with what the United States does about the problem. And then we also have Nina Jankowicz. Nina is ubiquitous at the moment because, in case anybody hasn't noticed, she's just written a book, which I would wave at you if a publisher had actually delivered it to me, but it's PDF only. So Nina is doing the waving at this point. Look below Chiborashka on her bookshelf. Nina's book is How to Lose the Information War, with the subtitle, Russia, Fake News and the Future of Conflict. And if ever a subtitle looked like a devil's bargain with the publishers, that's probably it, because it's about so much more than fake news. Now, those of us who've been pounding this beat for more than a couple of years will remember the splash that Peter Pomerantsev's book, Nothing is True and Anything is Possible, made when it was providing anecdotes from the front line, as it then was, of the reinvention of information in Moscow. Well, that front line has now decisively arrived in our capitals, and that's where Nina comes in with a counterpart to that book. It's Dispatches from the Front Line. It's a survey of different European countries and how they're grappling with the information warfare problem. Not just disinformation, not just social media, but actually malign influence overall. And Nina takes lessons from there and then applies them to the situation in the United States. Putting all of that together is how we get these lessons from three continents about what works and what does not in foreign contexts, dealing with malign influence, dealing with disinformation, and what we could apply in order to safeguard our own democracies, our own societies, our own political systems, and our own countries. But just before we get on to hearing from Matt and Nina, we're going to have a little audience participation round. This is the fun part. Anna, who is working behind the scenes at Chatham House and making everything technical work here, is going to be shortly putting up a poll on your screens. And this is where you can actually join in and tell us what you think are going to be the most effective countermeasures for countering foreign malign influence in Western liberal democracies. What countermeasures do you think are both going to be effective and actually workable? What's feasible? You'll see we have several different choices here, and we're going to let you have just a minute to glance through these and choose which ones you think are actually going to be the most realistic. Choose your top three. We'll capture those answers. Once you've had a chance to read through the bottom, make your choices, we will keep that. And then we're going to review that at the end of this session, after both Matt and Nina, and possibly even me as well, a little bit, have had a chance to talk about all of these problems and see if we change your minds or not. Now, while you're having a look at that and making your choices, let me also introduce the rest of the behind-the-scenes team that we have here at Chatham House. Anna's running the technical side. She's assisted by Quinton Scribner, and also James Nixie, the head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. James is co-chair or backup chair, because if I'm struck by lightning or there's a Russian interdiction on my broadband, James is the one who steps in and keeps the show on the road when I fall offline. Put all of it together, and we hope we're going to have a really quite interesting remaining 85 minutes to chat over these issues. We're going to hear a little bit, first of all, from Matthew and from Nina, and then a bit of back and forth with me asking specific questions that I want to hear from them about, based on their experience from each of their respective countries. And then we're going to throw it open to audience participation. I'll say a little bit more about how exactly the audience can ask questions when we get to that point. But for the time being, let's have a look at how the poll is shaping up. We have quite a few different people who've managed to put in their answers. We've got 2/3 of people who've now made their choices. Let's give it a minute more just to make sure that everybody has a decent opportunity to read them through and consider which are actually going to be their preferred choices for what's going to work in dealing with foreign malign influence. That's still ticking up. We've now got just over 2/3 of people who've made their choices. Okay, that's looking good. We'll give it just a minute more. Some interesting responses coming up here. Of course, these answers do depend very much on the quality of the audience. And we have noticed that not only do we have top quality speakers today, but we also have a lot of people actually participating in this, joining in from outside, who many of them themselves could actually give these presentations as well, and are deeply, deeply knowledgeable both about malign influence and about what Western societies are doing to counter it. So I think we're getting a different response here to what we would ordinarily see if you ask the general public. It's an informed response, but it's nonetheless interesting for that. We have nearly everybody who has cast a vote at this point. We'll just give it another 30 seconds to make sure that everybody has their last chance. And that's looking good. Anna, can we capture that and save it for later on? Thank you very much indeed. Now, we are going to go with Nina first, because Nina has done this broad survey of what's happening across Eastern Europe and then compared it with what's happening in her own country. And of course, there's plenty of news just from the last 24 hours to actually apply those lessons and see whether anything that she's seen in that survey of European countries would actually have helped the situation. So both of our presenters, Nina first, 10 minutes or so, please, if you wish to go ahead and deliver your key lessons for us. Thank you.
Great. I don't think I'll take 10 minutes, partly because it's my neighbor's lawn care service time, so there's going to be a buzzing in the background as I speak this morning. Thank you so much to Chatham House and to our esteemed panel for joining me today. It's really an honor to be with you. I only wish that we could be doing this in person, but such as it is, I think this is a good second option. I wrote this book because when I was living in Ukraine, working as a strategic communications advisor to the foreign ministry under a Fulbright grant, that's when the US election happened. And revelations about Russian interference and Russian influence were suddenly present at the front of mind for many, many Americans for the first time in a long time. But of course, all of the folks on this call know that Russian influence operations are nothing new. And certainly watching all of that unfold from Ukraine, really, it irked me in some ways, if I'm being quite honest, to see this problem looked at as if it were something entirely new. We know that it's not new. We know these countries have been dealing with this problem for more than a decade in some cases, and there are responses that are tried and true and tested. I think the thread that runs through all of the case studies in the book, and it looks at Estonia, 2007, Georgia, 2008, Poland from 2010 until the present, the Czech Republic and Ukraine, specifically the Netherlands Association Agreement referendum in 2016. The thread that runs through all of these case studies is that we cannot fact check our way out of this problem. It is much broader than that, and we're not going to convince anyone by debunking. Often these debunking, there's a lot of evidence that this doesn't actually convince anyone to change their mind. In fact, it underlines the false information in their minds. So that's number one. Number two, we need to look at citizens-based solutions. So when I talk about citizens-based solutions, I don't think it's a coincidence that in our poll we had a lot of discussion of media literacy and civics. When these countries are even remotely successful in dealing with foreign influence, whether from Russia or any other nation that is going to be meddling or conducting these interference campaigns, they always have some sort of solution that deals with the root of the problem, the fissures in our societies that are being exploited by bad actors. And that's a demand side problem. It does deal with media literacy and civics, but it also deals with investing in the media climate. In Estonia, for example, pumping up the Russian language media so that there was something on offer that wasn't just Russian state media coming across the border was an extremely, I think, good investment for Estonia. And I don't think it's a coincidence when you look at the more resilient countries across Europe, some of which aren't in my book. I'm thinking in particular of Swinland, that's a new country, Sweden and Finland, that, they've got robust public media. And certainly that's something that the United States is lagging far, far behind on, especially in the United States in news deserts, in places in the heartland of America, in the South, where there aren't reporters on Capitol Hill anymore interpreting what's going on in the Capitol in big cities for folks in a lens that matters to them and their experience. The PBS and NPR affiliates that are in those areas are sometimes the only local news that they have there. And so we really, really need to be investing more than the $3 per person per year that the United States is investing in. And I think in that case, that's one area where the UK is far exceeding the US response to disinformation, understanding that journalism is a public good. The BBC still has a high level of trust among Brits during a time of crisis. And I can't think of a single news outlet in the United States that would garner the same level of trust. So that is the main thread running through the book. The other important kind of more wonky policy-oriented side of things is that not only do governments need to recognize that disinformation is a threat, which both the United States and the UK to some extent have had problems with that. The Russia report is just coming out next week, right? So we need to have had that much earlier if we're going to really have a fulsome recognition of this threat. Certainly in the United States, we have a much larger problem that has to do with our commander-in-chief. But all of these countries recognize the threat, and they recognize the fact that disinformation is a threat no matter where it's coming from, no matter what the vector is, whether it's a foreign vector or a domestic vector. And increasingly, we're seeing information laundering and the use of homegrown actors throughout all of these case studies in my book and here in the United States to give an air of plausible deniability to these operations, to separate the Internet Research Agency or the Russian security services from the final product here. And I write about in the opening chapter, which was an excerpt of which was published in Politico magazine a couple of weeks ago, how the Internet Research Agency in 2017 used advertising to support a protest, an anti-Trump protest that was already ongoing. But they used that advertising money to attract more people, to attract more attention to that protest. And it just shows how they not only are using groups on both sides of the political spectrum here in the United States, not only using pre-existing fissures, but using those homegrown actors, often unwittingly, to deliver their messages. And this underlines for me, and this is a great place for Poland to come in, where Poland certainly has been using a lot of domestic disinformation over the past 5 years. We need to just underline that disinformation is a threat, whether the vector is domestic or foreign. You cannot separate the two. You cannot have a fulsome response to foreign disinformation if you're allowing it to happen willy-nilly in your political sphere. And that's the most important thing for me as an American as we head into 2020, and something that I'm going to keep getting up on my soapbox about until it's no longer necessary. And just as the lawn cutting service has stopped here, I think that's where I'll end my remarks. I'm really looking forward to interacting with you, seeing the second version of the poll, and taking your questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Nina. I should have mentioned at the start a special greeting to all of our guests who are joining us from Swinland today. Matthew, you've heard Nina's arguments before, and you're familiar, of course, in detail with the content of her book. Tell us about both ways. Tell us about, first of all, how much of that is transferable into an Australian context, and also, what's Australia doing that Nina hasn't mentioned, but we might actually be able to import as useful experience for dealing with this kind of problem, and of course the more pervasive one of foreign influence that's embedded in institutions? So, Matthew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Keir. And Nina is definitely a hard act to follow, particularly considering the quality of her bookcase. I have a much poorer one in my man cave in Canberra. Look, I think one of the things that we need to do, and Keir's going to hate me for this because he doesn't like inspecting problems and admiring them. He wants solutions, and I promise I'll give some. or at least some potential solutions. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time admiring the problem, because you can't really make effective policy. You can't really deal with the problem of malign influence, which is such an amorphous type of arena, without, I think, defining the problem in some way that allows you to deal with it properly. So I'll give you some perhaps lessons that we've done here in Australia, and how that might fit in an American context, perhaps as well in a European/UK context. Now, first of all, I think problem definition is really important, and we do need to get away from the tendency to view the issue as something that is just cyber-enabled info ops. I know it's the most sexy topic to look at, but it's part of the problem, but not the whole one. So I think the way that we tend to view it here in Australia, at least, is in three kinds of dimensions. And the first one is to recognise that fundamentally malign influence, whether it comes from internal groups or is amplified by a foreign power, is fundamentally a social cohesion issue. So this is about the division, manipulation of views within society by fringe groups or fringe parties that try to normalise discourses and shift them somehow towards the centre. Now, in Australia, we have dominant discourses on these types of fringe areas that would be pretty familiar in Europe and in the United States. They're things like anti-immigration, Islamophobia, but also in Australia too, xenophobia as well, I'd say. Like much of the West as well, we tend to have engendered a situation where we've got a relatively low bar, I think, when it comes to evidence, and a relatively low bar when it comes to critical reasoning. And part of that is due to the fact that there aren't very many incentives for media, even mainstream media, to engage in some of the very costly, some of the time-consuming investigative journalism that they used to do. They're incentivized primarily by clickbait, and that's what their business model is. So I think that's the first sort of general lesson in terms of social cohesion and awareness, is that a lot of the work we have to do is about encouraging broader buy-in from society, to encourage things obviously like cyber literacy, evidence-based assessments of information and so forth, whether that's targeted at anti-vaxxers or anti-globalists and some of the sort of conspiracy theory tropes that are associated with the alt-right. And because we know that malign influence, especially from foreign actors, tends to amplify existing fissures within society rather than necessarily creating them themselves, this is something that fundamentally does, at least for Australia, become a sort of whole of society problem. So that's the social cohesion aspect. The second one is a little bit more esoteric, and I think that's the sort of trust in democracy problem that we see throughout the West. And that's not in terms of just individuals and ideas and institutions, but it's much more all-encompassing than that. A couple of years ago, the Museum of Australian Democracy, which does a lot of polls about how Australians feel about living in their society, came up with some pretty stark results, which found that there was very low levels of trust in political parties, very low levels of trust in political leaders, but even low scores on the question, or at least the statement, Australia should be a democracy. Only 53% agreed with that, which is really quite stark. Now, the challenge, I think, is pretty difficult here because it's hard to change that level of trust quickly, and it's hard to do it without really strong leadership by political actors. Because political actors these days especially are very tempted to appeal to sort of populist tropes, trot out one-line or three-word slogans to infantilize the electorate, and in fact make the problem worse. So that's two problems. The third one, I'd say, is a sort of elites problem. And by elites, I don't mean just political elites, I mean economic ones and societal ones too. And I think that, at least in Australia, we've started to come to the view that elites are a little bit like critical infrastructure. When we talk about critical infrastructure, we talk about hardware and systems, we talk about software and code, but we also need to be aware that wetware, the humans, are also very important in the whole thing as well. So basically, if you have individuals within a political party or a political party itself that's compromised in some way, the system of democracy really starts failing. So one of the things you really have to do is to try and inoculate your elites, both political and economic, as well as societal as well, as much as possible. Sometimes you do that by persuasion, and sometimes you do that by sort of more formal means. And in terms of those formal means, how do we specifically tackle it? I think actually Nina's right in saying that we have to take a sort of vector-based approach to the problem. And in Australia, there are sort of three arms to that. There's the legislative arm, there's the regulatory arm, and the sort of narrative landscape. In terms of legislation, we've got a couple of things. FITS, the Foreign Interference Transparency Scheme from 2018, that was primarily the response to an Australian senator who was having his legal bills paid by a Chinese businessman, and in return for that, this senator, Sam Dastyari, made a number of very, very complimentary comments about the South China Sea as belonging to China and how the Taiwan problem should be solved from Beijing, etc. He resigned in disgrace. But the Foreign Interference Transparency Scheme says, okay, if you are accepting money and you are engaged in political communication from if you're an individual or you're an organization, you have to register. And that targets politicians, it targets think tanks, it targets friendship organizations, particularly things like Confucius Institutes. And just recently, last week, there was a raid by the Australia's internal intelligence organisation, ASIO, on a New South Wales senator, where the supposition was that they were amplifying, or at least staffers were amplifying a pro-Beijing view. The other part of the legislative stuff is that we have the Defence Trade Control Act, which focuses particularly on things like dual-use tech. Now, we know, of course, that with investment in AI and investment in automation research, a lot of that, and even health, can have applications in the military sphere. So there's an increasing supervision overview by the Department of Defence when it comes to research in STEM fields that may have dual-use military applications. In terms of regulation, we've focused a lot more on oversight of foreign investment, particularly since we have a lot of foreign investment from China. And it's no surprise and no secret that the head of our Foreign Investment Review Board used to be the head of our Foreign Intelligence Organisation, ASIS, and our Domestic Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, a man called David Irvine. And the Foreign Investment Review Board does things like making sure you can block large-scale buy-ups of mining companies, telcos, and that type of sort of critical infrastructure or critical resource arena, and blocking things like buying up of agricultural land, and playing a role also in doing things like blocking Huawei from launching 5G services in Australia. The third aspect is narratives, right? So you respond to malign influence in any way with narratives. And personally, I think that's the weakest link that Australia is yet to master. We've managed to arrive at a sort of bifurcated discourse. You have panda huggers on the one side and dragon slayers on the other. And ultimately, this is not helpful because it produces a dialogue of the deaf. We have one particular group of parliamentarians who call themselves the Wolverines and have little badges with scratch marks on them after the 1980s teen angst movie Red Dawn, where a bunch of American teens go and kick the commies out of small town podunk America. And this is sort of kind of juvenile cosplay stuff, unfortunately, and it kind of cheapens the message that you're trying to send, which is there are national security risks from these types of malign influences, and they cross all those spectrums that I mentioned. So, in fact, if there are lessons, I think that I'd say, number one, from Australia at least, we need to remember always that it's not just cyber. It's even in many cases not even predominantly cyber, it's compromat. It's all sorts of other types of problems as well. Second thing is that any response is going to need broad buy-in, that this is a whole of society, not just a whole of government problem. Third, I'd say that the easy targets are often the least problematic. It's very easy to go after a useful idiot or a proxy. But the things that are harder, the manipulation of views over time, the embeddedness of particular types of business interests and so forth, those are very difficult to unwind. And I think fundamentally also we need to be very wary that we don't create ourselves hazards in all this, that we don't go too far down the sort of security liberty or security side at the expense of liberty. Because if we do, we'll end up basically in trying to create a resilient democracy, we'll find that we're not a democracy, that we've overregulated, that in fact we've created a really divided society and made the problem worse.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Matt. Thank you both. That's a great introduction from both of you. And I hope in particular you can see why we decided to broaden this out and bring Matthew in as well, because from the perspective of what you normally say in terms of countermeasures from where we sit, a lot of the things that Matthew has described sound a lot like taking the problem seriously and actually gripping it and doing something about it. So with luck in the back and forth later on in the conversation, we can see how some of that might actually impact on individual experiences that other people will share from the audience. We're going to open it up to audience questions in a moment, after I've tried to draw out a couple more things that I wanted specifically to ask Matthew and Nina about based on their own experience and research. Let me say a word now about how the question and answer is going to work. First of all, a reminder, this session is on the record. We may possibly be releasing a partial or full recording of it later, so if it's a private question, keep it private. If you do wish to raise a question, then there is a raised hand function in the Zoom chat where it's an electronic raised hand as opposed to waving at us, which we may not see. Alternatively, type your question in the chat. And when you're sending the question in the chat, please do make sure that it is to everyone as opposed to me or to moderator, because if you lose me, you lose the question. So it's public and open to all, unlike the poll responses, which are anonymized. So bearing that in mind, do please think about composing your questions and things you'd like to tease Matthew and Nina out on, but it's my turn first. And here, Matthew, here's your reminder, first of all, that we are on the record because of this next question. And it's specifically about that Russia-China balance in Australia. So we know Australia has a major China problem, but recently it seems also to be getting a bit of a Russia problem as well, when it would seem to be pretty remote from Moscow's traditional area of interest. Now, in your view, what lies behind this sudden spate of policy writing in Australia that is echoing Russian narratives? Is it actually part of an inspired campaign? Is it people arriving at Moscow's conclusions on their own behalf? What's behind all of this, do you think?
Look, on this one, I will disappoint everybody, I think, by saying that I don't think that this is a cozy or fancy bear or anything else type of initiative. It's a product of the way that we are approaching the China narrative and the China issue. Australia, of course, has its largest trade partner is China, and its main security ally is the United States. So we are subject to all sorts of push and pull forces. And given that we've become more assertive and a bit more muscular on the PRC, the question comes out of that, well, if you're going to try and balance against the PRC and the United States is perhaps not quite as reliable as it has been in the past, then how do you do that? And one answer is to perhaps try and split away some of Beijing's friends. So this is effectively a geopolitics argument that's being made rather than necessarily one, I think, related to foreign interference. The argument being, let's reverse engineer the Sino-Soviet split. Let's get the Russians on board. I've referred to this as a 21st century geopolitical Hail Mary. Let's try and get Russia to rejoin the West, because after all, it was our fault for pushing them all towards Beijing. I don't like that argument at all. I think it's actually, there are very few areas where Australian and Russian interests intersect. We're economic competitors. That's going to get worse when it comes to energy. We're an American security ally, and a strong one. And we're a champion of a rules-based order that Moscow really wants to get rid of. So given those conditions, I'm not quite sure whether you can have a sort of incremental Helsinki-style process of cooperation that then brings Moscow back into the fold, or even the deep kind of rapprochement you would need to convince Moscow to start balancing against China. I mean, why would it? So I think on this score, the Australian commentators who've written on this have simply got the geopolitics wrong, and they've simply got the rationales and the motivations wrong. When it comes to the sort of foreign interference issue, we don't have a Russia problem yet, but we could have, or we have something of a Russia problem. We have the usual suspects. One of my colleagues repeatedly refers to a bunch of Cossacks in New South Wales who want to promote Russian ideals. They have a newspaper with a circulation of 5,000. I'm surprised they have an actual physical newspaper. And if it's circulating to 5,000 people, you can probably guess the relative age of those who are receiving it. We've got some Russian mafia on the Gold Coast and some organised crime ties. But there is not a strong Russian diaspora to mobilize, as you have in places like Estonia, as you have in other places in Eastern and Central Europe. So we also don't have particularly strong far-right parties that Moscow might seek to push and prod. That said, however, there are a couple of things I can relay that I get told by all sorts of people all the time, and that is that the stuff that we see in the foreign interference space and the stuff that we recognize is Chinese. The stuff that we don't recognize or just leaves little hints we suspect is Russian. And that Australia is a bit of a testing ground for Russia to try things out before they go and use them on you. And by you, I mean colleagues in the UK and in the US. So to an extent, we could be a bit of a canary in the coal mine, I think, when it comes to Russian influence.
Thanks, Matthew. That's fascinating. So on both the geopolitical assessments of the relationship with Russia and on spotting the Russian interference when it occurs, could it be that it's actually, because it's not a traditional area, it's just the lack of expertise and lack of experience in recognizing what's going on and knowing what Russia is all about? Is that the case?
I think it's got a lot to do with it. One of the problems in Australia is that Russia expertise is low. And also that cyber expertise is low. Effectively, we decided in 1991 that the Russia problem was solved and we could all go off and worry about something else. So we worried about Japan and then we started worrying about China. So there is a lack of sort of country knowledge. There is a lack also, I think, of quite sophisticated understandings of the way that the Russians do business as opposed to the Chinese. We are very focused on the United Front Work Department. And we are very focused on various charitable organizations that the Chinese sponsor and business groups and so forth. We pay much less attention to the Russian side. So this is why I say, if we take our eye, or if we look only at one aspect of the problem, we're going to end up with a dual problem, and that's a Russia problem as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, of course, Australia weren't the only folks who let Russia drop out of sight in 1991. Speaking of out of sight, Nina, one for you that's based on something that I know you've been digging into quite a lot. We've seen huge resources poured into studying and analyzing the visible campaigns on major social media platforms like Facebook, like Twitter. They're the ones that get all the headlines. They're the ones that get all the money thrown at them. But what about the stuff that we don't see? Whether it's on closed Facebook groups or subreddits or niche social media platforms or even niche interest fora. What's bubbling away below the surface? Is it serious? And if it is serious, why do we hear so little about it compared to the stuff that we can actually see?
Yeah, this is something I've been talking about a lot in the lead up to the election here. I think we are still so focused on looking for cut and dry fakes, whether that's a fake news website or a fake account. People see the term fake news and think that that's all it's about. But really, there's so much more. And this is, as you alluded to in your introductory remarks, something I did have a little bit of a tiff with my publisher about, because they wanted fake news in the subtitle of the book as kind of a signpost for curious readers. I had to relent, as we know how that title discussion goes, but for me it's the wrong term all around, because a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, not only is it not fake, but it's also not even necessarily disinformation. It's about community building and building trust. And unfortunately, because of the pressure on social media platforms right now, the bad actors have adapted their tactics. And rather than doing those easy cut and dry fakes that they were to some extent doing before, they have gone underground. Mark Zuckerberg likes to call Facebook the digital living room rather than the digital public square, but I've taken to calling it, especially groups on Facebook, the digital creepy basement. This is where all sorts of bad characters are congregating out of the prying eyes of moderators, out of the prying eyes to some extent of Facebook's algorithms. There's a lot less moderation going on in these closed and private spaces. And it makes it a lot more difficult for researchers researchers like me to get into those spaces without breaking Facebook's terms of service. So plenty of researchers have throwaway accounts that they use to infiltrate these areas. I personally am into kind of infiltrating the groups that are similar to my areas of interest. So I've recently started joining a lot of groups from my home state of New Jersey, where they are having a fierce battle about reopening the economy. And there's a lot of mis and disinformation floating around in groups, but they are the perfect vector for disinformation and for bad actors to manipulate, because people are already segmented by audience and interest. They segment themselves essentially around vulnerabilities as well. The Reopen New Jersey group that I've been monitoring, this is full of anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists. What better place to plant one of these narratives? And you don't really need to do much. All you need to do is plop the link in there and it will just kind of take off on its own accord. So that's one huge problem. The platforms are incentivizing this type of behavior because it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing. They're saying, okay, you didn't want to see all that fake content from fake brands and fake news networks. Great. You're going to see more content from friends and family. Join these groups. Here are other groups that also have conspiracy theories for you to join. Great. Please join these as well. Here's some notifications to remind you that they exist. So they're incentivizing that extremism. But there's also a transparency and data sharing problem there. The platforms don't want us to know the extent to which the problem is being, is spreading, is proliferating. And so it's really difficult for a researcher on the outside to get a grip onto all of that. There's also a lot of bad stuff happening on encrypted messengers. This hasn't really made its way to the United States yet, because for some reason we all are still very happy to use iMessenger, which has some level of encryption, not as good as WhatsApp or Signal, or just plain old SMS. We don't have the WhatsApp problem, but we know that this has been a problem in India and Brazil. Recently in Ukraine, there have been a lot of Telegram channels that have been spreading disinformation, organized again around local news. So this is a trend that we're seeing. Folks are, joining a Telegram channel about beautiful Kharkiv, and people will post, okay, here's what's going on in the town square today. Look, there's a sale on at this store. And then, anyone can post to it. So there will also be links shared that are quite suspicious, and we don't know what's going on. And how do you counter that when it's an encrypted messenger and an anonymized to some degree platform? It's really difficult to do. So again, it's not just about those cut and dry fakes. These underground kind of spaces are increasingly being weaponized, and it's very difficult to track that in real time without more cooperation from the platforms. And that's where regulation can come in. I don't want to see the government removing content, playing whack-a-troll. I don't really want platforms to be doing that either, frankly, because then you enter into this very politicized discussion that the United States is in now, where there are allegations of bias against one or another political party. Instead, I would just like more transparency about who is buying ads, who is controlling groups and pages. I want, independent audits of algorithms and of content moderation practices to ensure that people's free speech is not being impinged upon. Because if you think Facebook isn't preferencing some speech over others, you are absolutely wrong. And this is, as we saw in the Twitter hack recently, also happening with large accounts on Twitter. So there's a lot that needs to be done. I don't think any country really has gotten an adequate social media regulation regime in place yet. And that's in part due to the fact that the United States is abdicating its responsibility in this area. Any other country can try to impose a regime on these companies, these platforms, but until the United States sets the standard, unfortunately, there is not going to be widespread adoption of that. And I fear that we've squandered the past 4 years in having these politicized discussions when really we have a duty to the rest of the world. So on behalf of my country, I apologize for that.
Well, let's come back to that point in a moment. One of the interesting things that comes out from this is how thinly the adversaries are willing to spread their resources to cover as many different avenues and fora as possible, and not just the underground spaces, not just the ones that are deliberately hidden, but also some which are simply a specialist interest. Here in the UK, for example, you see very obvious disinformation attempts taking place in fora where you would expect them to be, and expect them to be gathering information, like, for example, the Army Rumour Service, ARS. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you also get the same thing happening on Mumsnet, where you have to wonder what exactly the value is going to be. But the counter side of that, of course, is the what Graphica called the secondary infection program, where it spreads so thinly that actually it has next to no impact. And as we've seen with the new details on election interference here in the UK, the people who are plugging the leaked documents have to throw them out again and again and again, and eventually to resort to just emailing them to journalists, hoping they'll find one that is unscrupulous enough to publish it. Now, I see we have a couple of questions trickling in. Just while we give you a moment more, ladies and gents, to think about what you'd like to ask our participants while you have the opportunity. Nina, the last thing you touched on there, and this is unfortunately a brief but probably obligatory excursion back into major social media territory. Your views on current efforts by the big platforms to tackle this problem. Nina, you've made what you feel pretty clear. If there's anything you want to add specifically on the major ones, the minor ones, and the counter disinformation efforts, and the efforts to study the problem that work with them, like DFR Lab, like Graphica, etc. Anything you want to add on that? Have a little think about that. But Matthew, did you have a view on that problem?
Yeah, I do think that unfortunately, when it comes to the major social media platforms, they are caught betwixt and between, and have very much an incentive to plump for self-regulation. And it's a question that I ask my master's students on a regular basis. I teach a course on propaganda and information war, and I say, well, how do you best regulate Facebook, and how do you best regulate Twitter? Do you treat them as being part of the global commons? Do you treat them as, companies that you can actually sanction within Australia? What's the best way to tackle it? I think it's rather difficult. When it comes to things like, and I think counter messaging is very much the key here, that if you can encourage that higher bar for critical reasoning, encourage a higher bar for evidence, because here in Australia we have a phrase in our public service about evidence-based policy. And this is recited like a mantra, as those little magic wands you can wave. All you have to do is have evidence. And I tend to chafe against this because, as I tend to point out, and my colleagues, academic colleagues point out, you can use the same evidence to make a 180 degrees different argument. And when it comes to propaganda, it tends to be relatively simplistic, it tends to be didactic, and ultimately it tends to try and elicit some kind of emotional response in the target. And the thing I liked here best that I've seen, recently, in the last 2 years or so, were something that the Swedes did. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but this was this campaign that if it makes you angry, think again. That if you see some information there and your automatic response is to be outraged, to be angry, to want to red pill yourself, and go down the rabbit hole, then it perhaps isn't necessarily coming from either a reputable source or coming from someone who has legitimate intent. So I think that kind of thing is quite useful. We adapted a version of it when it came to our recent Australian elections. I can't say it necessarily worked because we don't have much data on it. But that type of thinking, I think, if you want to encourage people who interact, particularly within a digital landscape where, as I think the Rand Corporation said a couple of years ago, you're having silos of belief or silos of disbelief when we become so tribal in the way that we behave. It's very, very easy to fall into that trap of reacting to the thing designed to push your buttons. So exposure, I think, to a multiplicity of different political views, different social views, different cultural views is going to be part of that educative component. So it's regulatory to some extent, it's going to be legislative to some extent, but ultimately it's about learning. Now, of course, an academic says that, because I've got research grants that want to pick up on those types of things. But ultimately, if we are going to inoculate ourselves from this problem, it's one that we're going to have to learn about ourselves rather than necessarily rely on companies to regulate themselves or rely on governments to regulate.
Right. And of course, other countries have also latched onto that idea of getting people to think about whether something makes them angry, including the United States, except with the US campaign, it seems the thing that makes people most angry of all is whether they have pineapple on their pizzas, which was the DHS campaign. Nina, was there anything you wanted to add on that topic before we throw it open to our guests?
Sure. I agree with most of what Matthew said. And I think the important thing to underline with regard to the platforms, of course, very little is going to change. It's not in their business interests to change these practices because they're making money off of those emotional reactions, right? So some sort of regulation does need to come into play. I'd also like to see them taking on more of kind of a public service role. They have ubiquitous access to so many people's lives, and Facebook is, happy to remind me of a picture from 10 years ago of my dead father, or happy to remind me, that I need to take an umbrella out. But when it comes to the consumption of information and instilling good consumption habits on its users, it really doesn't want to go there. This isn't political. I don't think that this is something that anyone should object to, these sorts of reminders. They're happy to remind you to register to vote here in the United States, for example. If they were to work with experts and develop some really good media literacy, civics kind of interstitials that could come up on your newsfeed, I think that could be extremely effective, particularly if it's partnered with trustworthy non-governmental messengers that are delivering that message, either celebrities or, activists, non-political activists, the folks who are really just about democracy, a third party that isn't coming from the untrusted government or the untrusted social media platforms. I think that could be, again, really effective. It's a way into people's lives. And they're multi-billion-dollar corporations. They can certainly afford it. The other point that I'll make is that I don't think the social media platforms are really taking their global role very seriously. This is something I encounter time and time again in Ukraine. Just last year, Facebook finally brought on a Ukraine policy officer, but she's also responsible for several other, if not, 10 to 15 other Eastern European countries, which is kind of ridiculous given that Facebook and the problem in Ukraine is so large. Facebook is also its third largest growing market in the world is Ukraine, and yet there's only one person working part-time on Ukraine and its issues. I think, there is a lot more subject matter, cultural, linguistic expertise that Facebook could be investing in rather than relying on a few people in Silicon Valley, in DC, and capitals around the world. I'd like to see them really invest more in that because they truly are a global platform. And when we clamor about deleting Facebook here in the West, I just hope that everyone remembers that there are people in Ukraine, in Burma, in India, in Brazil who rely on it as their primary source, or a Facebook product like WhatsApp or Instagram as their primary source of information. So our deletions don't make a lot of impact, but clamoring for them to be more responsible stewards of information could actually have a positive impact on the world. I still do somewhere believe in the good that social media could do if their priorities were switched around.
Right, yeah, so raising that user awareness and consciousness of what information they're looking at, where it may have come from is the key to so much. But the question remains who's actually responsible for doing it and who is willing to do it. And there's another little case study which we can share with the audience. Nina, I know you're familiar with this one, which is the Canadian approach, which if you're not familiar with it, look up North American house hippo, which is a sufficiently distinctive phrase. You'll probably come up with the right answer. And that's a nice way of precisely this campaign of getting people to stop and think when they're consuming information. Let's open it up to the audience now. We've had Orysia Litsevich with her electronic hand raised for quite some time now. So I'm going to ask Anna in a moment to unmute Orysia so she can ask the question directly to whichever of our guests she wishes to. Just a reminder for everybody, it is on the record. Do please keep those questions coming in. We do have time to work through quite a few of them still remaining in this session. But Orysia, over to you for now.
Thank you very much, Kira. My name is Orysia Litsevich. I am part of Russia and Eurasia program running Ukraine program. I have a question first to Matthew, because you've raised the issue of social cohesion, and we have just recently published a study on resilient Ukraine, safeguarding Ukraine from Russian influence, and social cohesion comes as kind of this tissue that is so underlining the resilience of democracy. We are suggesting some remedies for specifically Ukraine, which is a large country, has different histories and different regions, how it can be stitched together, but Australia is the continent. So maybe you have some tips for experiences from you, how you would address resilience in times of these information bubbles, also entrenched more political groups and other things. And especially now in times of COVID, will people be meeting perhaps less? Are we going to stay more divided? And to Nina, you've mentioned that citizen-based solutions will be in a way effective. And again, we looked at the work of IREX in Ukraine, and I really would like to echo what you say, that it's not just cyber, that it's along the way, and you should not distinguish foreign and domestic for sure, because in Ukraine you could see the fusion between domestic media actors being aligned with this, for example, Kremlin agenda. They are not foreign, they're Ukrainian. So from your work in Ukraine, especially on strategic communication, you see poor capacity of Ukrainian state. It's just not up to the challenge. There are a lot of weaknesses. But how do you see Ukraine? Is it getting better? Is it in handling, this malign influence from your perspective? Thank you so much, Keir.
Matthew, did you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's good to be talking to someone who specializes, another person who specializes on Ukraine, on what is in fact the 6th anniversary of the MH17 shootdown, something which has animated, of course, people in Ukraine as well as Australia, where 38 people lost their lives. In terms of encouraging democratic resilience, in a place like Australia, it's very, very large, and it's very localized in terms of population. We have big population centres all around the fringes and nothing in the middle. That means that messaging, both negative, malign that is, and good messaging is often needing to be tailored to a particular local constituency. So the types of ideas and opinions you get in big cities like Brisbane are not the same from the types of opinions and ideas you get in places like Melbourne. Melbourne's much more multicultural, it's more cosmopolitan. Brisbane, and I can say this because I come from Brisbane originally, started off as a bit of a hick town and all of a sudden has decided that it's a global city. So demographics change and opinions change. I think we need to be quite wary and quite alert to where different pockets of opinion are, even though we don't have the sort of large Russian diaspora and we don't have the sort of cleavage down the middle that Ukraine does, where you've got sort of Donbass on one side and you've got the sort of pro-Western, more pro-Western part of Ukraine down the other. I like to talk about a four-step sort of approach to democratic resilience, and I call it ears. The walls have ears. Number one, the E part is sort of encouraging civil society champions, and this is something that Nina touched on. Now, I know there are only so many Samuel L. Jacksons and Tom Hankses to go around, but civil society champions are really important when it comes to promoting good messaging, when it comes to promoting good thinking and critical thinking about disinfo. So that's the civil society aspect of it. The second part, the A in the ears, is assisting private-public partnerships. And I don't think we do that enough either. We tend to have, at least in Australia, a situation whereby disinfo is something that the government tells telecommunications companies, you have a problem, you should deal with it. And the telecommunications companies and platforms say to government, yes, that's your problem, you pay for it and you solve it. So I think there needs to be mutual incentive on both sides and much more activation of that mutual incentive to basically show that everybody is working together. The R part of the ears is about regulation. Again, Nina's right, we do have to have some degree of regulation, whether it's on social media, whether it's on behavior of political actors, whether it's just simply saying, no, you can't accept, if you're a political party, a bag of cash with $100,000 in it from a very prominent business person and just put that into your put that into your coffers and use it to run ads. By the same token, you can't necessarily be the president or the vice president of a variety of different friendship organizations, run for office, conveniently forget you were the president or the vice president of those, and then when it comes out after you're elected, say, oops, I forgot, I now relinquish my role. So there has to be that regulatory aspect. And the S in ears is effectively about not just the insulation and the sort of deterrence function of a resilient society, but the sort of the superimposition of costs potentially on others. And this is the sort of dark side of it, that Australia is one of the very few countries that admits that they do offensive cyber. And I think that's something that we do need to take into account, even though we're going to get not very much information on it. We are going to have to sometimes do negative messaging in countries that we view as malign. And that's part of the equation too. So whereas building a resilient democratic society, a lot of it is defensive and about producing deterrence that makes the cost unacceptable, it's also about imposition of costs against others as well.
Thanks, Matthew. Two things I'd like to pick up on there. First of all, I should have explained that Matthew is a master of abbreviations and acronyms. And if you read his paper for the Journal of Cyber Policy, he actually mischievously throws in the 5 I's, as in capital letter I, standing for different things that Western liberal democracies need to protect. So we can from now on get horribly confused talking about the 5 I's nations, defending the 5 I's that make them work. But the other thing, and more significantly, that deterrence issue, that was one of the things that surprised me when the poll results came back that we held at the beginning of this session, that very few people think that deterrence, that striking back, is an effective countermeasure against that. And that's a point that I'd like to come back to towards the end of this session. But Nina, over to you first. And if you wanted to chip in on the deterrence issue as well as tackling that question, do feel free.
Let's come back to that later, because I have a lot to say on that based on yesterday's news, and I think it will just be nicer if it's packaged differently. I do want to spend some time discussing Ukraine after Orish's question, which I think is really apt. I think Ukraine actually is ahead of a lot of nations, at least in its recognition of the problem, right? They have to recognize that Russian disinformation is a problem because they are at war. That also, on the flip side, leads to some unfortunate tribalism in the Ukrainian information space that I think is hindering the overall response. Ukraine, as you mentioned, is doing well on media literacy, not just with IREX, but through the Ministry of Education, which has now mandated that media literacy be part of secondary school education. I would love to see more widespread initiatives targeting adults. I noticed in our poll results at the beginning that more people were interested in school-age media literacy programs than those targeting voting age populations. And I actually really think we need to flip it around. If you look at polling and studies on online behaviors, our kids are so much more with it than anybody from age 30 and up. And that I think is because from my generation onward, we are used to having some sort of gatekeeper in our information space, whether that is, TV, print, radio, to be content moderators. And when we see this information online, we don't have that kind of mechanism that kicks in right away that tells us to doubt it. And I'm not saying like skepticism on the whole is what we should be aiming for, but healthy skepticism, at least online, is really important. And I like the comparison that the general counsel of Adobe made when I was at a conference discussing deepfakes with him. He said, we've gotten to the point where we get an email from a Nigerian prince who's claiming he's going to make us rich. We know not to trust that. We know not to trust when someone is calling us in the United States, as I get probably 5 times a day now, claiming that my social security number has been compromised. We know not to give over those personal details. We need the same sort of mechanisms to kick in for people's online consumption. And that has to target voting age populations, because they are the ones that are making the decisions for our countries. And there are ways to do that, right? I talked about the social media responsibility there. Libraries, IREX has found that libraries are a great vector for this. And if you look at polling in the United States, they're still a very trusted institution, which again, we have very few of these days. And libraries are also looking for their raison d'etre in this new digital age. And I think it's a great place that we could target not only adults, but especially older adults who use libraries a lot, within kind of not only cybersecurity and kind of teaching them how to use their iPad to FaceTime their grandchildren, stick in some media literacy there, get them kind of flexing those muscles that they're not used to working. And that's where I think Ukraine could stand to improve as well, but they're steps ahead of the United States in that way. I'm also encouraged, although there is a lot to criticize the new Zelensky administration for, I was encouraged at the beginning when I was covering the campaign that Zelensky prioritized outreach to Russian speakers. I do think it is a mistake that the Poroshenko administration basically cut off the folks in the occupied territories and wasn't really doing any outreach to them in their native language. I understand the importance of Ukrainian as a national language, and I have covered and written about that interplay in Ukraine, but I think the truth is that someday there will be reconciliation in Ukraine, and you need to have some goodwill established there. And that outreach is a key part of that. So I don't think the Zelensky administration has made much progress in that outreach kind of mechanism they've been trying to design. I know they want to look at a new Russian TV network. There have been a few other issues. Zelensky has been going to the area more, so that's good. But I think there's room for improvement there, and I think all of that is going to kind of come at the expense of other reforms that are perhaps happening or not happening. Another thing there that Ukraine has kind of struggled with is the regulatory space. There are two laws that are not yet passed. They are still, they haven't even gotten out of committee in parliament that earlier in the year were causing quite a stir in Ukraine. One law on the media and another law on fake news and disinformation that were troubling and very broad in their definitions of the problem. They left disinformation as a very broad concept that the government could basically define just based on national security threats. And I don't think that is anything that we want any government to really have the power to so broadly define. It very closely mirrored the Singaporean fake news law, which has been roundly criticized by human rights and freedom of expression groups. Then there was the law on the media, which would essentially credential different media outlets. And if they didn't have those credentials given by the government, they wouldn't be allowed to cover government press conferences and things like that. Very, very troubling. This is not the tack that Ukraine should take in a democratic society. And this extends to the tribalism that I mentioned before. It's not just viewing always the information environment as us versus them. Again, that there are a lot of homegrown actors in this space, but anytime you take for instance, a defense of a Russian journalist who has been being attacked recently in the Ukrainian information space because of a critical article that she wrote about a fact-checking organization. That's a threat to press freedom, but people who have been supporting her are being attacked as Russian stooges. That sort of tribalism is really, really dangerous to a democracy. It is dangerous in an information environment because, as we all know, information is not black and white. There are plenty of shades of gray in there, and I think we need to lean into that nuance. Invest more in the media environment, invest more in protecting freedom of speech. Those are the areas that I think Ukraine can really flourish in. And hopefully it is tracking that direction, and with continued kind of pressure from Ukraine's friends around the world, it will continue to blossom in those areas and not go more toward the quashing of freedom of speech track.
Thanks, Nina. Yeah, there are a couple of points that you made there that actually also track back really quite interestingly to when we asked our audience what they thought of all of these. First of all, the media literacy education. There's a big contrast we see in the results between education and media use for school-age children, which was the most popular answer. Everybody thinks that's a great idea, but for adults, no, that's a far less popular solution. So there's a big contrast there between where people think it will actually work. And also the Singapore law that you mentioned, the POFMA law, the forcing media to issue retractions if they have issued fake news. Of course, Singapore is very happy with that because they see that it works and it's actually highly effective and it's largely addressed the problem. But that's not reflected in the poll answers that we got, where it says tighter regulation of social media platforms only got 11 people thinking that this was a good idea. And of course, it only works if you have a very homogenous society that has a shared threat perception, which is, of course, so untrue of most of our liberal democracies. We have quite a few questions building up in the chat. And if, ladies and gentlemen, you haven't been monitoring the chat, I'd suggest a quick look in there, because at the top you have the links to Nina's and Matthew's publications. And close to the bottom, you also have a link to the research paper that was mentioned by Aricia. And maybe, Anna, if it's open access, we could have that Matthew's Journal of Cyber Policy article. I'm not sure if that's actually public access or not, but maybe we could put a link in there. Well, we got some questions as well, which may be quite quick-fire ones, because they might be a little bit out of scope for what we can actually answer. And I'm going to combine a couple of them for Matthew specifically, because you might just wish to kind of bat them off because it's not something that you can or wish to speak about. The first one is from Maria Shagina, and this is not about Australia. It's in comparison with Australia. How is New Zealand navigating US-China tensions and addressing the Russia problem? Do you feel that you wish to talk about what the next door neighbor is doing, or is that a bit out of area for you?
Oh no, I'm quite happy to talk about our friends across the Dutch, as they would say, using what they think is good English. I can say this: I have cousins in Auckland. I detest them, frankly, but I have cousins in Auckland. New Zealand, the way New Zealand approaches this is really interesting in that I think they take much more, or have taken in the past, much more of a hands-off approach. Until the publication by Anne-Marie Brady on Chinese influence and interference. Now, this is an academic who found herself, very much hounded by Chinese groups, and investigated just the extent to which, the United Front Work Department had penetrated New Zealand society. Is very much a sharp critic, but not just that, of course. New Zealand is very much a framework nation when it comes to the Pacific Islands. In many respects, they have more legitimacy and more kudos than Australia does. Australia is a great big brother in many respects. We may give more aid, but we get less bang for our buck. The New Zealanders are generally more respected because they tend to take a more fraternal approach, I think, to Pacific Islands. And there, of course, you see a large amount of Chinese influence, particularly in appeals to political elites. We'll build you a port, we'll build you a football stadium, we'll build you a new presidential palace with, Belt and Road Initiative investment funding. And that is something that New Zealand really has, I think, stepped up on in terms of its public diplomacy, as well as its more private representations to governments within the Pacific region. The big challenge, of course, is that you have nations across that space who are partially democratic, who are fully democratic, who are non-democratic, and also a very localized media landscape, which tends to very much welcome investment. An investment on a scale, when the Chinese are doing it, that cannot simply be matched by New Zealand, by Australia, even by the United States, in fact. If you want to sell the message within the South Pacific that, we will provide you with fast streaming video on your mobile device, and really all you have to do is, we'll look after your data, we'll store it in Shanghai, it'll be fine. No worries. This is something that people generally have no problem with because, again, you need to perform that sort of education function, think twice. The governments understand it fully, I think, and the governments within the South Pacific, and this is where the New Zealanders come in, governments within the South Pacific are simply saying, okay, well, let's just see how much we can get. The Kiwi approach is, well, let's try and have good governance. Let's try and have good standards. Let's try and have, and this is the message Australia tries as well, but I think New Zealand is probably more effective. The Kiwis did flirt with membership of the Eurasian Union at one point. Yes, it came out in the New Zealand Herald, but that didn't really go anywhere. This was, and Russian interest, of course, within the sort of New Zealand South Pacific space is similar to its approach during the Cold War, in that if you got a number of different states interested in Russia, you could do deals on fishing rights, which could translate into an investment. That could translate into things like General Assembly votes in the UN. So there is that game going on in the Pacific, and I think that New Zealand has woken up to it. I also think perhaps that the level of intensity of debate when it comes to Chinese influence is not the same as in Australia, and that New Zealand does tend to be much more, I'd even say, measured when it comes to that debate.
Well, that's great. So we have a case study of dealing not only with the wall of disinformation, but also the wall of money that comes with it and backs it up. Matthew, there's another quick one. It may be a quick one that's specifically for you. It's from one of our regular attendees, Mary Dejevsky. She had two questions. One of them has already been, I think, quite thoroughly dealt with by Nina, talking about Ukrainian media space. But the second one was a what about question. It's, how does the provision in Australia for organizations to register as recipients of foreign money differ in essence from Russia's foreign agents law for NGOs? And if I could just ask both of our speakers to condense the answers a little bit so that we can get through as many people as possible before the end of the session.
Look, in terms of registering for the Foreign Interference Transparency Scheme, the uptake has been very low. It's not something that is absolutely mandated. It's something that's heavily encouraged. In fact, Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, about 6 months ago, sent out a diktat to his department to say you must get more registering. Universities have been particularly resistant to do this because they might receive money from all sorts of different governments at the same time. The incentives for Australian universities primarily have been, if you want research funding, go and find it from external sources. And the predominant external source of that funding has been China. The problem is, if you're not incentivizing it by saying go and look at it from Five Eyes places, universities have never met a dollar that they can't spend. And so they will get it from the PRC. So universities tend to talk about academic freedom and the importance of being able to basically say whatever they want. And this is not necessarily something that is covered, or at least can be dealt with in a punitive way by the Countering Foreign Interference Transparency Scheme. And even under the guidelines, the UFIT, University Foreign Interference Task Force, these are all self-monitoring, self-regulatory types of things, as opposed to the way NGOs register in Russia are routinely referred to as agents of foreign influence. I know plenty of people who work for Carnegie Moscow who worry about whether they're going to be closed down on a monthly basis and kicked out. I don't think we've closed down any Confucius Institutes. We've simply had a discussion and a debate about them, about whether perhaps some of the information that comes out of them might not be skewed one way or the other. So I think it is a levels of intensity problem when it comes to this type of issue.
Great. Thanks very much, Matthew. We have a couple of related questions here about countermeasures and specifically counter-narratives. We have Peter Ferdinand asking what kind of counter-narratives are most effective in countering fake information, and I suspect possibly Nina might add, if any. And then there's a possible partner response to that from Brian Cartledge, our former UK ambassador in Moscow, saying, on the question of deterrence and counter-narrative isn't a slippery slope on which democracies would embark at their peril. Wouldn't we risk beginning with the FCO's old information research department to end up with a full-blown ministry of propaganda? Now, Nina, we haven't heard from you in a few minutes. Did you want to have a few words about both of those?
Sure. So in the Ukraine chapter of my book, looking at the Dutch referendum in 2016, I kind of argue that trying to directly counter message against Russian disinformation is a losing battle. I mean, Ukraine, there were a couple of unfortunate events that led Ukraine to not really mount a great campaign against the Russian messaging in the Netherlands in 2016. But because Russian disinformation in that campaign was targeting deep-seated Euroscepticism in the Dutch population, I think it was very, very unlikely that they were going to change any minds. What can change minds is behavior, and that's where I agree with the ambassador and his comments. I don't really believe that we should be doing that sort of negative counter messaging. I think what we need to do, as any good writer knows from getting their work edited, is show, not tell, right? We have a lot of problems here in the United States right now. The best thing that we could be doing to tell the story of democracy is to be responding to the protests on the streets, moving toward a more equitable, more democratic form of government rather than the opposite direction, which fuels a lot of the whataboutism and widens the fissures in our societies. I know it's kind of a roundabout answer to say that, you know, we need to turn inward and focus on good governance, but Matthew even was discussing that with New Zealand. I think that, you know, if we have something to aspire to, something that is worth aspiring to, that in itself will tell the story that we need to tell. And we're still struggling with that, with democratic backsliding throughout the West right now, including in the United States. I don't exempt us from that. Where we are going to do counter messaging and it's going to be effective, I think it needs to not come from organizations that are, you know, USG or Western government branded. I believe that, you know, these populations should be speaking from themselves to themselves. And I like the idea of small grants that organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy do, like some of the work that the Global Engagement Center of the State Department is doing, where they're funding investigative journalists and civil society organizations that are shedding light on the problems in their own societies, rather than us going in with a sledgehammer and saying, this is bad, America is good.
Okay, Matthew, did you want to chip in or pass on that one?
I'll be very quick. Just on counter messaging, a couple of things I'd say is one, you need to pick targets fairly carefully because we've all got limited resources and the population has limited attention span. We talk about the old Russian fire hose. I prefer to view it as a sawn-off shotgun where you just fire pellets into the infosphere And it might be men too, it might be long-haired cats, it might be Black Lives Don't Matter or All Lives Matter. And all it takes is for someone to reach out and pick up one of those pellets. They're part of an ecosystem. Do you respond to all of that holistically? I don't think you do. And I also think in terms of attribution, given that that can be problematic, there's so many proxies operating, it's better to try and shoot the message than the messenger. And I think that's sometimes a problem that we fall for. Say, oh, this is Russian disinformation, this is Chinese disinformation, this is, you know, Iranian and so forth. It often turns people off to do so. So on that, pick targets carefully. When it comes to deterrence, I'll fire back. I tend to think that when it comes to cyberspace, the norm space is very weak. We talk about Talon 1.0, Talon 2.0. That's all very nice. That's a lot of people who don't do offensive cyber against one another saying they won't do offensive cyber against one another. Awesome. So deterrence is about learning, fundamentally. And deterrence, I think, is about learning that there are costs for things that you decide to do. And you can only have experience and participate in deterrence if you have had that learning, that imposition of costs on yourself. I do think that there is a space for it. I don't think there is a space for banging the normative drum and becoming a prisoner of our own norms and our own values. I don't think that works these days. I think more in terms of sort of negative counter messaging. What does Vladimir Putin fear? He fears color revolutions. So I think counter messaging that goes along the lines of, you know, are you happy with society? Are you happy with the way that power is constructed? Do you see a good place for a good future for your children? Do you think the economy will be okay? Do you worry about the future of Russia? Those types of things are part of the suite, if you like, of messaging options that we can deploy.
Great, thank you. So deterrence is critical, but it's got to be done right. We have what may be another very quick question from Stephen Dial, who, of course, in his former roles has been directly involved in experiencing the impact of a Russian hack and leak attack of the kind that we've seen publicized here in the UK just over the last couple of days. I'm not going to read out the question in full, partly because Stephen, I know with his BBC background, is intimately familiar with libel laws here in the UK, and so we've got somebody else to read this whole thing out. But the quick one, for both of our commentators from looking at the UK from the outside, if you have a view, does the UK government really appreciate the problem? Who'd like to voice an opinion on that? And it can be as simple as yes or no.
I think the UK government is at least on the right track. I think there's certainly a lot more evidence that your legislators have held social media executives' feet to the fire. There is good thinking about this in your civil service. I know many of the people who are working on these things. Of course, there are, you know, qualms about the release of the Russia report being delayed, et cetera, et cetera. But when I look to the UK, I see a nation that is stepping into a role that typically the United States would be occupying. They're, for all intents and purposes, at least especially in Eastern Europe, seen as a leader in the countering foreign influence space. And, you know, I look to, even after the Skripal affair, looking to Theresa May's statements that she made that in no uncertain terms pinned that on Russia. Right now in the United States, that's unheard of. So perhaps my comparative advantage or disadvantage is coloring my judgment, but I think you're miles ahead of where we are. Of course, I don't think where we are should be the standard.
Matthew, any thoughts from your side?
Very quickly, yes and no. In that, yes, I think the UK appreciates the magnitude of the problem. No, in terms, I think that it moves relatively slowly to get there. And I'd say that both in terms of the Russia report, which we've been waiting on for quite a while, but also, of course, the Huawei decision, which has been relatively recent. And there's been, I think, plenty of information, not necessarily that Huawei itself is a malign, negative piece of kit. Ultimately, of course, there are very good arguments for 5G and Huawei 5G. And frankly, when we get 6G and 7G and next G and whatever, a lot of that may well be built on Huawei tech. So there'll be an ongoing problem for us, particularly given that there's no real still competitor necessarily. But on Huawei, it's been the prospect that this could be used for malign activity. And I think that it took a little while for the UK to wake up to that, or if not to wake up to it, to act on it. So I think more speed and Yeah, more speed and haste, frankly, from the UK would be good. Even though, as Nina says, yes, it's definitely a leader when it comes to countering the foreign interference space. And everybody does, I think, eventually come at the right decision. A bit faster would be good.
Of course, one thing that the British government has been spectacularly and surprisingly good at is making the Russia report look like a conspiracy, as in not releasing it, even though it might be completely innocent, and the bureaucratic obstacles that they say might actually be true. But it's been so skillfully handled to get everybody awaiting a bombshell, which everybody's been trying to conceal. I think we should prepare ourselves for a great disappointment when it does come out finally. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 10 minutes left. We're going to take 3 or 4 minutes at the end just to revisit that poll, to ask you to have another vote and see if your views have changed, and then have a little look at what those results are. But there's a question that I've been saving because it's one of the big ones that always come up. It's Tony van der Tock from Klingendahl Institute, who's asking the question about the metrics. And this, of course, is one that we return to again and again. He's saying, how effective is Russian or Chinese disinformation, especially on social media? Don't they miss the deep understanding of how issues play out in a different national or European context? Put simply, does it work? Can you give us just a couple of minutes each, please, on that?
I get this question a lot, and in the United States, it usually comes down to, did it change any votes? Which, frankly, I'm not particularly concerned with. I don't think it needed to have changed a single vote to have been effective. What we're talking about is the influence over the discourse. And if you look, although the metrics, we still don't have a full understanding of the metrics. And I think that's important to underline, going back to my earlier comments, that we don't have access on the back end to actually what happened. And the platforms have only given us kicking and screaming what Congress has asked for. So we don't have an understanding of the full picture. But even from what they released, the ads and then the organic engagement that was analyzed by the Oxford Internet Institute and New Knowledge separately, we're talking about millions upon millions of engagements. We're talking about a hack and leak operation that targeted one of the 2 main political parties in the United States and affected the discourse in a key moment before the election, affecting not only how the campaigns spoke about themselves, affecting how they talked about each other, affecting how the media spoke about the campaigns. That has to have an effect on how citizens and voters are also discussing our politics. And that effect on the discourse, I think, can't be discounted. The other thing that I would say is that if you look at the individual campaigns and individual strands of narratives, I liked Matthew's comparison before to kind of a scatter gun. I think of it as spaghetti at the wall. They keep throwing spaghetti and they see what sticks, right? Sometimes they find a very sticky piece of pasta and keep throwing that. But the idea is to flood the space and to make us distrust everything that we're reading, to distrust the institutions. This hack of the vaccine organizations that are searching for the coronavirus vaccine, I saw that, and of course, not surprised that this is happening. Of course, Russia's going to do that, and many other nations are as well. But what makes me worry about it is the fact that we didn't get a strong statement from our commander-in-chief about it. And you know, what does that make people think ahead of the elections? Okay, they're hacking the vaccine. Are they going to hack our critical election infrastructure? They just need to, you know, rattle the doorknob on the cybersecurity door to inspire that distrust. And the distrust in the system is what keeps people from turning out and participating. That's what Russia wants. They want our democratic system to not be one that has that fulsome participation. And that's what I'm scaredest about. It doesn't have to be a super effective campaign that changes minds or changes votes to really change people's behavior. And we have evidence of behavior change, from people signing petitions to turning out to protest. And unfortunately, I don't think we've raised the costs enough to discourage Russia from engaging, or any other bad actor for that matter, from engaging in these very low cost activities. The return on them is just too high to, you know, stop doing them, unfortunately. And so, yes, I absolutely think there is an effect on the discourse and a follow-on effect on people's behavior, even if the individual campaigns analyzed in a vacuum don't seem that effective by the advertising metrics.
Yes, indeed. Matthew, your thoughts?
Yeah, in terms of measuring it is very, very difficult. So the best, I think, answer to the question is, you know, does it hurt? The best answer, I think, is it doesn't help. And I'll go back to 2016. The fact that you have more engagements online with fake news in the week prior to the presidential election than with mainstream news the fact that you have large numbers of people endorsing or believing to be true the statements that Pope Benedict had endorsed Donald Trump for president, that Hillary Clinton had an incurable illness, that Hillary Clinton sold guns and weapons to ISIS, not just Republican voters, but even Democratic voters, much higher proportion than you would expect, saying that they believed those statements to be true, up to 20 to 30% of Democrat voters believing those statements to be true, is indicative, I think, of this sort of narrative shift. And this is the problem when you have fringe discourses, that when you have the amplification of existing fissures in society, you normalize them and you shift them towards the center. If you look at American society in 2020 and compare it with American society in 2015, it's extraordinary the amount of, the degree to which that narrative landscape has shifted, in which so many things are now normalized that previously would have been completely dismissed as fantastic and idiotic. The fact that even, you know, QAnon conspiracy theories and lizard people are now the fringe as opposed to the absolute lunatic fringe, is indicative, I think, of the extent to which it can penetrate a society that is ripe for division. And I think the United States has been ripe for division for quite a while, unfortunately. But I don't think that that's any comfort to the rest of us. There are a lot of people I talk to in Australia who says, oh, can't happen here. Nah, you know, Aussies are much more tolerant. No, it can. It can if Breitbart decides to set up shop. It can if you get your localized version of InfoWars. It can if you have cabinet ministers retweeting white genocide myths from South Africa and Zimbabwe, which happens here. And it can happen across democracies because, of course, the biggest vulnerability of democracies is the fact that it's ultimately an argument without end, that any view can be articulated. But the problem is that we don't, I think, nurture that point of consensus, that common ground, that political center. We just assume it will look after itself. No, it has to be nurtured, and it's something that we need to do a much better job of.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I must not go over because I will get into terrible trouble with Anna. We've heard a lot. There are nuggets here which I will certainly go back and revisit, not least to make that tricky choice between the analogy of a sawn-off shotgun or spaghetti at the wall, because this is going to determine how we talk about these things going forward. But Anna has just kindly put the poll up again. What I would like to ask you to do, ladies and gentlemen, is having heard everything you have, and in some cases having had your specific questions about specific issues answered. What are your views now? Have a little, I don't believe you can see the previous answers at this point, but let us know what you feel. Now, we know from the chat how one person at least feels, Kirsten Derinovsky tells that it's a comment rather than a question. The US does need media literacy for the adult segment of the population, if for no other reason than to stop bleeding. Do more people feel like that now that you've heard Nina and Matthew explaining their views and their experience, having looked at what is happening on 3 continents and trying to figure out what works and what does not? We have just a short amount of time left before the end of the session, but please do take a moment to let us know your views, and we will be fascinated to see whether anything has actually changed from the early stages. I'll just give you a few seconds there to put in those answers. And in the meantime, thank you very much to those of you who've put in messages in the chat, thanking our speakers. Let's not forget that for Nina, this has been a very early start, and for Matthew in Canberra, this is actually quite a late night. So thanks to both of them for joining in. And of course, everybody that has joined us from quite an impressive range of countries to listen in and get those lessons from their study and their research. Now, Anna, do we have a hard stop in 1 minute and 45 seconds? Yes, okay, I'm getting a nodding head. So, ladies and gents, if you could just make your choices now in the poll briskly, and then we'll have a quick side-by-side comparison before we wrap up altogether. So yes, we do see that there is some shift there. We see that one of the ones that we were expecting was the education in civics and democracy in media use for adults, which has shown a substantial change, perhaps unsurprisingly. Not so much in terms of deterrence, not so much in countermeasures, striking back, or any other forms of deterrence, and in fact, yes, just comparing the two there. Fact-checkings and rebuttals. Well, as we suspected, given the conversation that we've had about exactly how effective that is, that proportion has dropped. Now, anybody that's looking at the recording of this later on YouTube may not be able to see these poll results directly in their screens if they're not captured by Zoom, but we will be sharing them, the before and the after, later on, and you'll be able to see that in Chatham House's social media postings. But for now, thank you everybody for joining in. It's been a great session as far as I can tell. I've learned a lot from it because there are things that that both Matthew and Nina had contributed that I wasn't expecting, despite the pre-match discussions. And I hope it's been informative for everybody else as well. So please join me in a virtual clap for our participants. Thank you very much to everybody, and we will see you online next time.